This is Against the Grain on Pacifica Radio and online at kpfa.org. My name is C.S. Song. There's very little, it seems, that Mike Davis can't write about with authority. Obviously, he does his research. Passionately, he vents his outrage. Obsessively, he points out who's doing injustice to whom and why. Keeping up with Mike Davis is difficult. He posts prolifically on the web. He writes and edits numerous books. And he sounds off on everything from the current economic meltdown to the military or prison industrial complex to racist immigration policies and way beyond. Mike is a San Diego-based writer, historian, and activist. His books include City of Quartz, Ecology of Fear, Planet of Slums, and recently In Praise of Barbarians, Essays Against Empire. Davis has also written online articles about the economic crisis and Obama, the U.S.-Mexico border, and climate change, and we'll focus on some of those writings today. Mike Davis joins us now by phone from San Diego. Welcome back to Against the Grain.
My pleasure.
Let's start with the economic crisis or meltdown. What was your initial reaction to the steep fall of the Dow?
Well, to be honest, it was similar to the reaction of Jehovah's Witness who looks outside his bedroom window and sees stars falling from the sky. As a Marxist, I've, of course, been studying crisis theory for most of my life, but never expected to see a meltdown on this scale or happening with such velocity. What took 3 years during the Depression from 1930 to 33, that is to globalize, the downturn, happened this time in a matter of 3 weeks.
A certain kind, perhaps, of a feeling of redemption or elation, even.
Well, yes, there was a brief moment of shouting, right on Carl, followed, of course, by the recognition that the people most responsible for this were gently floating to the ground in the golden parachutes. And it's ordinary Americans and people across the world who, of course, are the ones who are going to suffer, massive bankruptcy, unemployment, and as we saw in the paper today in California, what is promising to be a destruction of a vital part of our public school system. And, we're barely into the first phase of this crisis.
Why do you start an article about the economic crisis with a rumination about people's perception about the Grand Canyon or of the Grand Canyon?
Well, simply because of the challenge that the Grand Canyon placed to the perception of its first explorers. They were literally overwhelmed by it because they had no referential landscape to measure it by. In the most real sense, they lacked concepts to see the Grand Canyon. And so the question I raise is, does Washington, do our policymakers, would President Obama have the concepts to understand what this crisis is really about? And to what extent can we apply the analogies of the Great Depression to understand the crisis, or the analogy of the New Deal to understand the kind of policies that have to be adopted?
Well, let's get right to that. Are we, in your opinion, experiencing something that's analogous to the Great Depression, or at least the beginnings of it?
Only to a certain extent. The Great Depression, of course, happened in a world where obviously trade was very, very important, but the workers in American industry lived in Cleveland, Toledo, Youngstown. Now the labor forces, American corporations, often in the majority, live somewhere else. To use a term that's favored by the MIT types who design financial derivatives in the first place, the world is become so tightly coupled. And one of the promises of neoliberalism was precisely to create a system in which capital could move almost with the velocity of light across the globe. Well, so can prices. And the big question that political reformers will face in Washington is whether there still exists a kind of national economic space to build our way through some kind of Keynesian program out of the Depression. I think not. I think the whole idea of New Deal in one country no longer makes any sense. It has to be a New Deal on an international level. And I actually believe that the Chinese working class in many ways holds the keys to this crisis because, of course, for the last 5 years, the Bush regime has kept the economy artificially alive, demand artificially alive, by borrowing immense sums of money from China and Japan, while on the other side, China's been saving officially a fantastic 40% of its income. And what this really means is that in the absence of health care and social services and with extremely high rates of exploitation, the Chinese workers had been paying for the credit bubble overseas, which the Chinese government supports because the quid pro quo with giving Americans credit has been keeping the price of Chinese currency down. And, that means, ever going, export industries. I know this sounds a little complicated, but what I'm trying to get at is the simple fact that it will require a degree of international solidarity between labor movements to get out of this crisis that in a sense wasn't necessary in the United States of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
A lot of people here are obviously concerned about the impact of the economic crisis on people in the U.S. and maybe in Europe, but there isn't really much talk about how a global economic meltdown might affect China. Any thoughts?
Well, look, I mean, we've lived in a crazy world for the last 5 or 10 years, and it has no analog in any economic textbook of whatever denomination you might want to pick up. That is that the developing countries of the world are exporting capital to the richest countries in the world. In the beginning of the Great Depression, the United States was the world's biggest creditor. Now we're the world's biggest debtor. And even I think in the fairly conservative financial press, you'll find glimmers of understanding that what has to happen to get the world economy moving again, if that's possible, is that the power of labor in China has to increase, that more of the Chinese economy has to be driven by internal demand, and that requires a more equal distribution of income. It above all requires the ability of Chinese workers, to organize as a class, to have legal unions. And obviously the regime is very, very worried about that. There was some, remarkable footage last week or the week before, a plant in southern China that was closed down without warning. And the workers were out in the streets protesting, immediately surrounded by, huge numbers of security police. So I guess I believe to some extent that the kind of scenes that you saw in Flint, Michigan, and Pittsburgh in the mid-1930s of the great strikes and sit-ins, you may see something like that in China. Globalization, in some ways, while it's weakened the sociological supports for kind of classical labor movements and other countries, has kind of realized, the pages of Das Kapital in China, creating the largest industrial working class in history, concentrated in great industrial cities and factory neighborhoods. And I think what, may shake the world is the response of Chinese labor to unemployment in a situation where much of the safety net that Chinese workers once had no longer exists.